Well, good morning, everybody. I think it's really important for me just to say it's not going to be led by me. You really don't have to worry about that. It's going to be led by some far more intelligent individuals. We've got Alex. Alex is a global leader in study startup and feasibility. We've got Amanda, who leads all of Takeda's patient recruitment and retention. And then we have Michele, who is the global recruitment lead for several projects over at BMS. Now, I don't believe my slides are working, but that's totally fine. It could also be me. Myth number one, I'm going to go to the audience first. So myth one is the US is the best performing country for digital patient recruitment. Can I see by like a raise of hands if you believe this is true or if you believe this is a myth?
You said true and myth. Which one are we?
So raise your...
It begins.
Rules of engagement have been set now, so raise your hand if you think it's a myth. That's got to be 70%. Do we go to the panel for a raise of hands, or do we just jump straight in? Who would like to go in with their opinion first?
More than happy. Oh,
Go on.
Yeah, go ahead,
okay,
please.
more than happy. So I think I agree with the crowd. Myth on this one. And I think a pervasive theme that you'll hear from all of us is one size doesn't fit all. So we can speak in generalities here, but there are always going to be exceptions to the rule. But when I think about in my experience how the US performs in digital patient recruitment, it is oftentimes very challenging. It is oftentimes less than that of what we would see from, obviously, activities outside the United States. And some of the reasons that I've seen this thus far is, again, and we just heard it so profoundly in the competitive landscape, the reality of just how many clinical trials are available. I think the other core consideration is standard of care. So as our trials continue to become more complex, as our inclusion-exclusion criteria become more complex, the reality of standard of care in the United States and access to advanced therapies very much changes that decision-making model as a whole. And then I would say lastly, site processing, bandwidth. We've already heard it today. There is so much we are asking of our sites. There are so many clinical trials that they're supporting that for all those reasons, I have not seen the US typically to be one of our best performing countries when it relates to digital recruitment.
Awesome.
Well, to pick it up, and I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is the digital part, maybe we come back to that. The second is really the point of view aspect to this. I'm a Brit. I worked for American companies most of my life and certainly work with American friends and colleagues every single day. And I constantly reach out and ask to my American friends and say, what is it actually like to be a patient in the US moving through the US healthcare system, and compare it to my experience in the UK. The short answer is it's a myth. We know Australia is cheaper. When we benchmark, countries like Spain are the cheapest. But from a recruitment perspective, countries like Estonia have the best referral networks. And as a European, as a Brit looking in, I know I've been told that the concept of referral is incredibly different here than it is in Europe. And in those ingrained healthcare institutions, primarily around Europe and other parts of the world, my own perception of what it would be like not to be referred is completely alien. And how that then translates into what it might be like to use a system that's reliant on referral networks, and how you might try and use recruitment tactics to ensure you're broadening the net in certain indications is crucial. So that aspect of having a very clear understanding of where you are and what the perspective of the site, the country, is completely paramount. You know, the second part is the digital side, and it's almost like the flip to my previous answer. Those old, bureaucratic, complex national institutions are slow and conservative, and they are incredibly difficult for them to change. Where we see true innovation, at least in the UK, it tends to be in the private sector, and then you see that migration into the public healthcare systems. So I'd say part of the answer is it's a truth. The US is at the forefront, tends to be at the forefront of these innovative techniques, because the nature of the healthcare system lends itself more to pulling up those techniques, and that's where we try and learn and see what we can implement. But again, it always comes back to really understanding the site and the country perspective and what's best for them.
And I'm just going to sort of continue along that line. So I think when we look at the US, we have to really look at indication, we have to look at age group, demographics. So digital marketing, digital communication is going to work really, really well with certain age groups, demographics, locations. We also have to think about socioeconomic challenges. Does everybody actually have access to social media? We make assumptions that people are on their phones, have computers. I know in the last presentation, it was shared started at the presenter started at the site, then moved into sponsor work. I have very similar experience, and you recognize when somebody comes to the door, they may have a phone in their hand, but they don't actually have service on their phone. We forget in the US that people use WhatsApp for communication because they come from other countries where that is a source of communication. You don't have to pay for it. These are things when we think about digital, we have to really expand what our definition of digital is and how we apply it and how we pull it through. So I think when we pull it through correctly in the US, we actually do well. We just have to really think about how are we doing it, where are we doing it, and when are we doing it? Because it will not, one size does not fit all. And if we just keep throwing the spaghetti at the wall, most of it will slide down. If we place it nicely, it sticks.
Maybe to ask a pushback, because I also agree that it's a myth when you look at straight patient recruitment or digital patient recruitment, just purely on a cost per randomised. There are areas in Eastern Europe which are so much cheaper for just about any indication, or even if you go to oncology, an area like China. But do you see there are areas where the US is leading the way, where they're doing something that no other country is doing, which could challenge the notion that this is a myth?
I suppose just, well,
No, go.
to add some clarity, when you're speaking to that, are you speaking still in the digital realm?
I'd say across the board.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think that there are definitely areas in the United States where we do see advancements when we think about traditional patient recruitment. I think that's just due to the availability of access to healthcare data. So when we think about the specificity of how we target our patients, digital, to your point, can be very broad or can be very specific. In the United States, we have the luxury of being able to access EHR, EMR, pharmacy data, claims data, you name it, but what that does allow us to do is have greater specificity in our patient targeting, higher conversion rates throughout the funnel, able to access trusted health entities in the community. That changes that dialogue dramatically. So I would say, yes, there are certain components in the United States, and much of that is due to access to medical data that we then, within the pharma realm, compliantly are able to utilize to then have that specificity.
I'm just going to jump in there. And also, once you have this data, you then have to connect that data to an individual, to the patient, to the human experience. And I think that is where we're missing a little bit, because digital communication has its value. It elevates us as people to be better at what we do. So that is the challenge of sort of pulling through the digital messaging, the digital pull in, and then immediately convert to the interaction on a personal level. Because also when somebody says, how did you get my name, when we're looking at data mining, it is, for a lot of people that doesn't feel right. It's one thing if I answer a social media ad, I'm clicking, I'm making that choice. And we all know, even when an individual makes that choice, an hour later they said, what did I do? I'm not answering that call when it comes. So what do we do digitally to help that message? And I think that's really important. We think about smaller clinics and putting information on their digital platforms, messaging. I mean, in the days that I was on the site, I printed posters, stuck them with a thumbtack. There are ways we can use our digital messaging, but how do you make digital messaging warm? And it's hard, it's a challenge. You're trying to grab somebody very quickly. So data mining is amazing in the US, and it gives us as the sponsor, gives our sites access to something they don't necessarily have, but you can't just then say, great, I have this. So it's really, really, really important to make sure we never separate out that human piece and the reality that somebody's really scared, whether they're making the choice to click, they're still scared, and whether we're cold calling somebody.
Any final comments on your side, Alex? or-
Only back to what I previously said, we almost look in with envy at things like this to the US and say,
Totally agree
if
on that.
only that were,
100%.
wouldn't that make, and even from a sort of I say a personal perspective, I mean, the aspect to which medical systems in at least the UK are so disjointed are quite frightening, frankly, even though like something happens to you and what that means for you in terms of your treatment. But it's starting, and there's a few companies that have even been presenting here that we work with that are starting to work out ways that you can't get claims data in the same ways in the US, but there's ways to access where patients are in terms of demographics, in terms of published materials, in terms of what those individuals say they're working in, that allow us to start finding ways. So yeah, it's a learning experience, I think, coming from outside the US, but definitely making progress.
Awesome. Myth 2, so rare disease and oncology patients are always expensive to recruit. In the room, hands up if it's a myth. Oh, people aren't as brave on this one. Okay. Not sure, so... Alex, I know you went last, but... Do you want to start?
Depends how you look at it again a little bit. So yes and no. At Amgen, I spent the majority of my career working in oncology. I talked to our colleagues here at Clariness and said that really if you talked to us even 5 years ago about using recruitment services in oncology, we'd said, well, forget it. There's just no hope. It's not going to happen. The world moves on. Amgen acquired Horizon about 2 years ago, and that vastly changed our portfolio and, frankly, our mindset about what you could do in any kind of indication where you're not looking at a broad population, very narrow sets of principally inclusion criteria. I mean, I'd say oncology, rare, anywhere else, but it's the set of inclusion criteria that's really driving the tactical performance that you're looking for in terms of these kind of outreaches that you're trying to configure. So primarily, again, it's driven by understanding what you are trying to achieve from the perspective of those that are delivering for you. And so ultimately, on a per patient basis, yes, because you have to be far more specialized, you have to have a partner that's working with you that understands in far more fidelity the nature of the, let's say, marketplace of patients. But ultimately, we find in the long run, that translates still into cheaper overall outcomes. If you don't do those things and you just leave it up to serendipity, you're generally in for a higher long-term cost basis than if you go after these things in a very specialized way.
So I'll say two things. Let's define what is expensive. That's a relative term, and I think we are going back to people. Let's honestly not put a price tag on people. That's just my belief. But when we talk about clinical trials, all patients are expensive to recruit. I do think we are focusing on the oncology and rare patient in the statement, but I do support a lot of I also support some oncology hematology trials, rare patient. However, I also support immunology, and I work on our book of work around lupus. And one could argue, wow, that's not rare, that's not in that world. But when we talk about that inclusion-exclusion criteria, it moves. It's that continuum of where is this individual on their disease journey. And even in a larger diagnosis, you're still looking at a finite number of people. And then you also have to cast that wide net, a very large funnel in a disease like lupus, to make sure you're not missing somebody. So in some respects, when you have a rare disease, you already have an established, limited community. So those individuals are often connected with the smaller, limited number of patient advocacy groups where we can tap in. So I think what you said, Alex, is really important. Your sort of line, your continuum is much short, your line is much shorter to get to the population, to those individuals, to those partners around that disease, where larger numbers, diseases that impact larger populace, then we have to do much broader communication. So that expense actually sometimes can be somewhat equitable. And it's a challenge, but let's go back to the fact that I really define expensive, and is there a dollar sign we should put on connecting people to clinical trials? Now I have to convince leadership at my organization and everyone else here, but I'll continue to say it.
Yeah,
No, and I echo the sentiment of what we're hearing here. In the sense of rare and oncology, it really is how you're defining that cost. When we're thinking about operational costs, as we've already heard today, the reality is that you oftentimes need larger number of sites. They're only recruiting 1 to 2 patients per year, larger enrollment timelines. So yes, all of that, if we think about it in pure operational cost, may, at the end of the day, increase from some of those others that have expedient recruitment windows, elements to like. But then when you think about additive recruitment, and I think you hit this directly on the head, and where we see the greatest success is that, to your point, the tried and true broad scale digital campaigns really aren't going to be your best bet. It really is, and going back to our last presentation, grassroots efforts, patient advocacy groups, elements to the like, which when you are quantifying the cost of that type of outreach is significantly reduced, but then you also have to think about the reality of scale. And I think that's where that complexity comes into your point, and really trying to balance all of those factors. So challenging to say myth or reality, because I think it very much is how we're defining the cost at the end of the day.
I think it's super interesting that we've all gone down that we can't put it, or we don't want to quantify it as cost. But you know from your senior leadership, it has to. And I know when I talk to them normally, it has to come down to cost. But for me, I think it's a myth in our space, or the direct-to-patient digital work. Because I look at a couple of studies, so oncology in China, oncology isn't always expensive. If you look at Sjogren's disease, I know it's not super rare, but in Poland you can find this patient very cost effectively. Well, everything you've said as a panel is true. Bad planning, lack of diverse tactics, going in sort of thinking we tried it before and it just worked that way and we're not going to have a backup plan. Yeah, you've got every chance on an expensive patient. And there is no doubt protocols are getting more complex. So yeah, really appreciate that. Our last myth is, and this is the one that took the longest time on our dress rehearsal, so we tried to leave as much as we could. So reaching patients is the hardest part of the recruitment process. In the room, hands up if you believe it's a myth. I'd say, 65% of the room there? And that's probably just, it's 100% of the hands, but let's see. Maybe we start with Michele first this time.
Sure, and I'll be completely transparent. No recollection of what I shared in our practice. Honestly,
is it really February?
We've spent the week listening. We've spent the week thinking about our challenges. We've all have lived experiences. Reaching patients the right way is the hardest part of the recruitment process. And it goes back to everything I've said, we've heard. You really can't just say it's a trial. You can't even just say it's an oncology trial. Can't just say it's a lung cancer trial. What are we asking the patient to participate in? What's their commitment? Where are people at? And so how do we message? How do we use that digital expression? And I think, we've talked about the sites a lot, the burden on sites. I was a study coordinator for many years, so our prior presenter talked about aging himself. So I worked on the site for 25 years in various roles, and I started as a social worker, if you can't guess that, and moved into study coordination and spent then a year as the administrator of our IRB. So I've seen the various lens, and obviously now I'm on the sponsor side. The challenge is that trust. Establishing trust, and to do that through digital communication is a challenge. So it's really, really important to connect, as soon as we have that digital engagement, a human being from the site. So why do I go back to that? Who's working at our sites, and how many years have they been working, and what's the commitment of that coordinator? It was a rare thing to see somebody who was actually a coordinator for 18 years and loved it. And I was invested and cared, and it wasn't a transactional activity. And so when we make things like recruitment transactional, we lose. We are not successful, and therefore reaching the patient becomes very hard because we see it as a transaction. If we see it as an interaction, it's a very different experience. Do I still think it's the biggest challenge. It is because where is everybody? How do we reach? And we also have to remember from a technical standpoint, everybody, and I said this yesterday on one of my panels, people receive information differently. So we have to remember it can't just always be the printed word. It may need to be audible. It may need to have larger print. It may need to have a different color scheme. We have to think about our imagery. I recently did do a patient summit, and somebody said, wow, it was a review of our materials, and they said, you spoke to me. I saw myself in this. So that is really hard to reach patients because I'm different. I may have the same skin color as my co-panelists, but we're all extremely different. And so recognizing that, where we came from, the door we walked through is the challenge in reaching patients. So you need to be across the board. And I probably went down a very different trail, but
I was going to say, who'd like to follow that?
Oh, I will attempt, but that was phenomenal. And I would say I would agree with all of that, but I'm taking this from a slightly different lens, I suppose. So I agree, all of the points that you make are absolutely considerations. I'm thinking of it in terms of the broader continuum. And when I'm thinking about it from initial outreach or really building that awareness through to actually getting that individual through the door at that study site for further evaluation. And where I've seen in my experience some of the greatest challenges is what we always define as that last mile. So the reality is that I may, through a number of channels, be able to identify a patient who notes initial interest, may even be able to have them pre-screen online, meet initial criteria, but then how do I get them from that interaction into the site? And some of the greatest challenges we've seen, and particularly coming back to the US, is collection of medical records. My goodness, I think we can all attest to how challenging that is, but truly being able to support the patient in collecting their medical records to then be able to provide through to the study site. Now, grant you, that's a subset of the patients. Some may be in clinic already, have that, but if we're thinking about external patients, extremely challenging. Also, I would say relative to that, just the site processing delays once more. Again, these sites are asked to do so much every day, and when they're always so appreciative to have these additional patients sent through to them, a challenge is truly just working through that bandwidth limitation for they then to be able to have that conversation with the patient. Just continuing on that journey a little more, let's think about scheduling challenges, phone tag, elements of the like. And then lastly, and one that I'm very passionate about as well, and I'm sure you would echo this sentiment, logistical and financial challenges. We heard in our first conversation today, patients that may be 1, 2, 3 miles from the site. But let's really think about what that then means in terms of those challenges to be able to not only physically arrive to that site, but how are we going to deal with time out of work, childcare. So again, for all of these reasons, I would say in my experience, the most challenging component within that continuum is that last mile. And it can mean many different things to many different patients, but I feel it's imperative that we within pharma really think quite critically on that front and think about how we can do better in that space. So again, I'd say that's one of the greatest challenges.
Alex?
Perfect segue. I think we had an example that we come back to. We had an atopic dermatitis study, 100,000 patients signed up online, 91% of them were contacted by phone, and the study struggled because rather than expecting a sort of a 3-day conversion of those patients, it turned into a 45-day conversion, and patients are getting lost. So many of the aspects that you've delved into there about like what's that perspective from the site. I feel like this has sort of been the theme of the Congress this year, really. Like, what does sponsor of choice truly mean from a site perspective? There was a great discussion yesterday talking about eSource and the sort of the overall summary, despite the many companies that have been here talking and progressing that model, is sponsor companies are not going to solve this world by bulldozing in and saying, you're doing it my way. It's simply not going to happen. And this is just another perfect example to me of we have to go back to saying not it didn't happen, but why didn't it happen? What is the perspective of the person who is the recipient of that data? What's their motivation? What other aspects of their working lives are interfering with their ability to do that? And that's where we find the best partnerships work, is where that high fidelity, detailed understanding of the place the study is sitting, the sites we are dealing with, and that partnership between the sponsors and the partner companies we have, that's where we really see the opportunity for progress.
I actually couldn't agree more with this group. So Something those that might have known me before will know I often intertwine patient recruitment with site engagement. And what we really need to, so I'm really in Amanda's core here, it's how do we motivate these sites to go above and beyond? Because normally we see the Pareto law comes, right? You get 80% of your patients from 20% of the sites. But what is it that motivates that site to go the extra mile? Is it we're doing direct scheduling? Is it that we're doing travel and reimbursement work? Because typically, I do find you can find any patient. We found APOL1 genomic kidney disease patients. The ICD-10 code was written last year. So anything is possible with enough, but it's can you get that site to pounce, and I hate to use the word pounce, but strike while the iron's hot, work very, very quickly. And ultimately, yeah, I think this is definitely a myth.